episode, opening clickety-clack intro. Welcome to Evolution Hour on our 20th of May, 2024. Yay! And don't forget, there are oodles of stuff at the wordpress.com website where you can download and share those PDFs to everybody far and wide. They still have a lot of information to them, even though, my good gravy, some of those are like 20 years old. Yikes. Anyway, let us welcome for our upcoming show today as we continue on episode 42 of our foray into Titans, the creationist dinosaur book of the earth, sea, and air, by Jonathan Sarfati and Joel Tay. And a part two in our alternating cycle, where we will be switching back and forth between a normal part two and an analysis of the 800 plus papers that Casey Luskin has been waving on the issue of junk DNA. That will be next week, next episode on that little puppy. Anyhow, as you know, they are Sarfati and Tay are in the midst of tyrannosaurs, and they're skirting around the edges of the details of things, functionally accepting Tyrannosaurid family-ish as a kind, and not going into too much detail on it, and a lot of gee whiz material, largely but not exclusively drawn from non-creationist sources. So they're talking about their visual acuity. There's a paper from 2006 that I'll be putting up on that, and then one by Matthew McLean from 2018 on its possible cannibalism issues, and that I will have more to say on. And then one from 2019 on their olfaction. That also has some interesting elements to it. So the McLean paper is of relevance because of who's the authors of it. Matthew McLean rang a bell because he is a creationist, and he, in fact, does not like evolution slam dunk at all, and did a little video on it where he kind of scampered around the edges. I think I alluded to that in an episode some ways back, a couple of years ago. Anyway, when the moment you look at the authors of that paper, and this, by the way, is in like Paleos. I mean, it's from an actual paleontological journal. No creationist connotations in any of it whatsoever, which again shows how it's perfectly feasible for creationists to publish in regular scientific literature. Which then brings up the issue of why Sarfati and Tay might be venturing outside of their normal name dropping to call attention to it. But anyway, McLean, most of all of them apparently have Adventist associations. So McLean, Leonard Brand, Arthur Chadwick, Keith Snyder, and then there are a couple others who are co-authors, David Nelson and Athenia Severio, that I can't find diddly squat on as to whether or not they have an anti-evolution position or not. They haven't shown up on the landscape, so I'm not listing them as at that boundary. And then one final author who is, as far as I can tell, not a creationist at all, Christopher Griffin. So you've got an interesting little network here of occasional papers being done by creationists in regular literature, not controversial, not inappropriate. In fact, Leonard Brand, I think, could qualify as perfectly skilled paleontologist within the framework of things, perfectly good at observations and all that sort of stuff. Never mind the fact that we're talking about predation and carnivory amongst tyrannosaurs, ergo pre-flood. So there's layers of significance in this, but Sarfati and Tay don't seem to mind the idea of pre-flood carnivory. So long as it's after the fall, they're pretty much copacetic on it. So I'm wondering whether they were making a point of alluding to this point from a paper done by fellow creationists just to get the little foot in the door. So there they are. The readers, if they do any follow-up research, they may very well discover that these are creationists. And since the paper is being in regular scientific literature, there's always the door opening up that maybe there is a potential window of opportunity for creationists to make more inroads. That's not really likely going to be happening. But anyway, enough with the tea leaves of trying to work all of that out as to why we're suddenly seeing a reference from the Adventist creationist side of the fence. The other paper that I wanted to bring up in particular was the one from 2019 by Hughes on dinosaur olfaction. And it was an interesting little bit. Olfactory receptor repertoire size in dinosaurs. All Sarfati and Tay were citing it for was just to bring up that Tyrannosaurus apparently had good sense of smell. But that's not what the paper's about. It is a quite detailed breakdown of the olfactory systems in various organisms related to dinosaurs, including birds, and where they're trying to work out retroactively what kind of genetic systems might have been involved with dinosaurs, make them consistent with what we know about what's going on in the light. So they come up with some suspicions about how many genes were involved in this particular area. This is a sidebar of paleogenomics, and of course it's knee-deep in the issue of bird evolution. So what I'm going to be wondering about is, will this paper ever get brought up later on by Sarfati and Tay when they get around to their Birds Ain't Dinosaurs chapters? We'll see. They put it on the mark, and therefore, theoretically, they should be addressing the kind of content that we're seeing in that area. Now, part 2 relates to Door Bechly. The ongoing tale of trying to deal with how he is approaching the intelligent design side of things, being an actual paleontologist, mainly insect research and insect systematics. But he's been certainly having jousts with a bunch of people in our network, from Dave Farina in particular, who is rather critical. Of course, he's a firebrand Behe person, which I've alluded to in previous episodes. But had a chat with Erica Gutsick-Gibbon a ways back, and has been taking pot shots at particularly Dan Stern-Cardinale and that network in relating to the genetic issue in this junk DNA component and all that. So anyway, Bechly did a post back in 2022, Fossil Friday, Walking Whales and Why All Critiques of the Waiting Time Problem Fail. Waiting time problem? This one is a particularly hilarious bit because Jackson and I had a discussion of this matter in The Rocks Were There. And it's in many respects a pretty dated and irrelevant issue. One thing that jumped right out at me, of course, is the whole point that they were bringing up the whale issue, because he was promising, Bechly was promising a response to their critics, quote, in great detail in our forthcoming technical paper, unquote, which, as far as I can tell, is a coming attraction. Here it's been a year and a half. No sign of it popping up at where. I'm thinking they could theoretically slip in one of these little pay for play journals that quite a few people in the intelligent design and creationist movement come up with. I mean, you get Armitage finding journals suitable to their interests. Or their one and only remaining intelligent design journal, Biocomplexity. Seen nothing whatsoever from it. So I've been itching to see this thing because whales are going to be a topic of volume 2. Hello, Hendrel. This will be a topic, whale evolution, in the new book, which is not only going to be discussing the creationist evasions on this point and their kind of schizoid issue about whether there were whale ancestors on board the Ark that turned into whales like after the flood. I mean, you know, that's a tiny minority position among some creationists, but I think Todd Wood, or Kurt Wise or Todd Wood, I'm always getting those two mixed up, kind of hinting in that department. But this issue about how supposedly whale evolution is impossible, and that there are all these hurdles at the genetic and biological level and not enough mutation time, and that's where he brings up this waiting time issue as a sidebar. The difficulty is that the extent to which the thing has come up in Dan's discussions, as far as I can see, are simply to point out that, yes, it was a thing that was thought to be something early on, and then pretty well got settled in the 60s and 70s as more and more scientific analysis went on the subject. So they were not claiming, Dan Stern Cardinale and company were certainly not claiming that the waiting time problem had never been considered at all, which is the implication that Bechly is trying to do in his. But mainly that once this thing was settled, it wasn't helping either intelligent design or young Earth creationism. Now, on this point, then, Bechly waived Martin Nowak, of all people, who is one of the most prolific of writers in the evolutionary field. Boy, he pops up as co-author on a zillion papers, including, by the way, the kind of controversial one about the issue of kin selection that was bumping around in proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences quite a few years ago, where he was bumping into the opposing camp on that. So it's not like Nowak is necessarily an oracle, but he's certainly an authority figure who is not at all helpful to the ID mythology. Anyway, Bechly offered links to 5 papers on this particular topic, which are supposedly pointing out the superiority of his position, none of which were relating to the intelligent design stance. And it's interesting and revealing that Bechly did not, in bringing up Behe's discussion of this matter, he did not cite Durrett's explicit criticism of Behe in the same journal. So Bechly's playing a little fast and loose, but I'll leave that as a sidebar. I'm not going to deal with that on this one. The point is that there were 3 of the papers of the 5 were not in my reference field. So I'm naturally going to look them up. As it turns out, all of them are open access, so you get to look at them too. So there's Schweinsberg 2008 and Durrett from 2009. That would be the same Durrett who has been explicitly critical of Michael Behe. This is the waiting time problem arising from the study of particular things. And a lot of these are mathematical analyses, by the way. And then from 2014 by Chatterjee, relating to the subject as well. Now, if anybody can legitimately find in any of those studies anything that supports the idea that the mutation rates and the way they accumulate in natural organisms and the detection rates of how they fix in organisms, that anything in those papers are supporting the contention that mutations would have to happen too fast to be biologically possible and therefore rule out things like whale evolution, let me know, because I don't see anything in those technical papers that are justifying that position. But Bechly seems to think so. Bechly has definitely been on my mind because of the discussion that Jackson and I are having in Rocks 2 about the worldview of the Discovery Institute in relation to Precambrian and Cambrian organisms. And Jackson has been particularly dismayed at the treatment of the topic that popped up in Darwin's Doubt. And Bechly has picked up the cudgel and has been carrying water as a defender of these positions at really remarkably verbose length. It turns out that on almost all the topics that Jackson is delving into, Bechly has posted like a lot of stuff at the Discovery Institute on it. I was quite gobsmacked at, like the 13-part series that he had on one of these organisms. I think it was on Kimberellia. And then the multiple ones he did on Claudina and Namocalathus. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's a bunch of tongue twister names on these. These are almost all, because they're Precambrian, they are not really at Lagerstätten level of precision, except for little tiny calcified bits and pieces. So they can look microscopically at the internal structure of some of these little shell casings and that are popping up, particularly with the Claudinids. But a lot of these are relatively blobby impressions that are very difficult to interpret. And so there's a huge range of discussion as to which phyletic groups some of these things belong to, and some are regarding some as annelids and some as cnidarians, and maybe some of them are lophophorates, and so you get big back and forths, which then Bechly is pirouetting through to basically create a fog bank of uncertainty, because Bechly is not expressing even the slightest opinion about what he thinks as an intelligent design advocate. Any of these organisms are they related to anything? Are they completely distinct phyla or whatever? He is not there to explain anything, which reinforces the fact that the intelligent design movement doesn't explain anything. Anyway, burrowing through all of this stuff, it was necessary between a couple of his posts. There's a lot of technical citations that he is invoking. And fortunately, I was able to track down the whole bunch of them in full text, pretty much. I think there's a couple of them that are very, very recent papers that I've only been able to get partial material on. But the upshot is that it's going to be an interesting foray in our book to the issue about how does one deal with extinct organisms that are occurring very early in the proliferation of what eventually become the phyla known in the Cambrian, themselves represented by extremely basal forms. And how are you going to be squaring this with our understanding of the developmental biology of the various existing organisms, which may or may not be part of these groups? So how much variation do you have with annelids? How much variation can you get with the shell formation systems that we see in the very limited groups of the lophophorates and particularly brachiopods that were much more diverse in the past, but we're seeing a relatively small number of examples today, and therefore, in principle, much less genetic information to be able to draw on, to be able to draw phylogenetic referencings. All of these are issues that are in principle going to percolate up and would apply just as much to intelligent design speculations as to evolutionary ones. And yet, consistently, none of that ever shows up in Bechly's interpretations of things. He's having no interest whatsoever in looking at the dynamics and the details of stuff. Now, it turns out that there's been half a dozen papers in just the last couple of years that have been expanding the field on a lot of these little organisms so that we now have a bigger sense of how much variety is going on. The claudinids that when I was first looking in the field many years ago were kind of little quirky tubular nothings. Now it turns out that there's enough fossils have been found, at least of the little shell casings of these things, that some of them made long, sinuous tendril type formats and the like that were apparently anchored to the seabeds. And it's therefore ought to be raising just fascinating questions about what's going on at the developmental biology level in the early groupings of things. So if they are annelids or something else, or cnidarians or something else, or lophophorates or something else, they presumably had genes, they presumably had homeobox genes, they presumably had a whole bunch of genetic structures in there, and little tentative step by tentative step, the evolutionary community is trying to sort things out and apply all of those field points to these ancient and extinct organisms that are not, by and large, known at the soft tissue detail level. So were some of them tentacled, for example? Depending on how one classifies them, they may or may not have had tentacles. And the snotty, arrogant quality of Bechly's discussions of these issues, where he's just borderline name-calling scientists as incompetent and papers that are absolute messes in his view, and he offers fatal problems with things by burrowing and checkering through for authority quotings and details and to go after these people. And if there's anything that he reminds me of, he's starting to sound way too much like Duane Gish. Like in one case where he was trying to dismiss the possibility that this particular organism could be a lophophorate. with a shell system, because the lophophorates have too much variety in how many shell forms they can do, and they can come about by various convergent means. This is exactly like Duane Gish trying to dismiss the early amphibians because their fish-like tails were too fish-like. So they couldn't be related to fish, could they? Because their tails are too fish-like. Whether or not, of course, Bechly has published absolutely nothing in the regular literature on any Cambrian or Precambrian organisms or their systematics. And frankly, I don't think he's ever going to. Not if he can't come up with that damn whale paper after all of these years. But it's an interesting bit. And we've also discovered multiple examples of genuinely blinkered pseudo-scholarship on his part, where he accuses a particular scientist of not paying attention to a particular paper when they had gone out of their way to just, oh, hi, Slade, I see you in the chat as well, had gone out of their way to call attention to this and offer reasons for it. Will be interesting to see how the field goes on. See, I've been anticipating for quite some time that eventually you're going to get some paleogenomics analysis, not unlike the kinds of stuff that's already going on in that paper relating to olfaction in dinosaurs in relation to birds, that same sort of thing is going to eventually start being applied to early Cambrian and Ediacaran organisms, because they will know more and more and more about the dynamic systems of what generates novelty, and they're able to experiment more and more with retroengineering things and working out what deep mutations might be occurring, and piecing these things together. Whether or not that's going to be taking place during my lifetime or another matter, we'll find out. Oh, and let me not forget to call attention and thanks to the patrons of our program, because boy, I am entirely grateful to every single one of you every single month. And it's a certain happy feeling to know that there are some people on the planet that don't mind these clunky videos that I do, that do not have the razzle-dazzle graphics and professionalism that you find with my colleague Jackson Wheat or Erica and others. That these are just the aimless ramblings of the old man in Spokane, Washington, but nonetheless, I will continue to do so. So thanks to our colleagues and researchers and assistant researchers and friends and legacy patrons who have helped over the many, many times that I've been at this little game. Couldn't do it without you, gang. Couldn't do it without you. So the ping pong match that's going to be going on over the next weeks and months will involve an awful lot of dealing at the source level with that bunch from the Casey Luskin gang. In fact, I will be adding on to that an addendum, because just recently Jonathan McClatchy had made a response to Dan Stern Cardinale, and he waived a piece on informed, choose up to two. As always, honest, well-informed, or creationist, choose up to two. Yes, I'm afraid that, well, from a methods point of view, my position is if you don't have a Tortucan mind, even if you're raised in a creationist context, you may wean yourself off of it. But if you do have a Tortucan mind, you're just not going to ever be able to wean yourself out of it, because you're too enamored of the system. And so the techniques that you would do to wean yourself off of a faulty view, which would be source checking and working out the models of things and all that, there's only so much that can do in a Tortucan mind without bumping into challenging fundamental doctrine that they don't want to give up. And I will, that's one of the points that over the long history of anti-evolutionism is really rare to find somebody who comes at it from that doctrinal position rather than just being raised in it, that ever gives it up. They are true believers, and they're undislodgeable, because underlying it is a faulty source methods where they're way too addicted to superficial secondary sources. Anyway, McClatchy comes in and puts a thumb in the nose of Dan Stern Cardinale, with another list of stuff on the matter of whether or not small regulatory elements can be triggered off by tiny fragments of DNA that are not showing up as being expressed much in the genome. And this supposedly opens the door for the ENCODE project's indication of low registering transcription to potentially mean oodles of things way bigger, like that 80% value that they were originally knocking around of functionality. McClatchy is wanting to hold on to that. So they waived this listing. McClatchy got together with Luskin and Sternberg and did another little list of some 55 papers, which it's turned out most of those were actually stuff from that 800-page list, 800-paper list that I will be going through. But there will be a small sampling of 20 that I'll be looking into subsequent to that. We'll also be relating the ones that do show up on the 800 list. So I will want to make a point of reminding about the context of them for the McClatchy bit. Anyway, that's going to be pegged onto the back end as a caboose of the main Luskin analysis. And it will take a while to plow through 800 sources. I'm reasonably confident, since biological material is so open access, that I won't have any difficulty finding the primary source papers on the subject. The first batch that we'll be tackling is are the ALU retrotransposons, and that's just like, yay, oh, goody gumdrops, because that's one that I've been interested in for quite a while, as one that poses tremendous theodicy problems for creationists, and it does for intelligent design people too. So we'll be looking into that. There'll be a spreadsheet analysis that I'll be cobbling up so that I can keep track of whether the source actually supports the intelligent design claim or not, which in this particular instance involves not merely finding an isolated example of something that's functional, but the implication that way more things are going to be functional enough to be able to alter the overall value of maybe 20% of the genome. It will have actual functionality in our case. And it may vary, it may fluctuate. You may have some, you might be 30 or 40%, because various organisms have different balances. Some have very few air quotes junk DNA in them. They're lean, mean little machines, and others have a colossal amount, even more than we human beings do. So it's an interesting little variable. I can already spot that a few of the examples that are on the big Luskin list involve some things relating to cancer research. And therefore, that will be the other category that I'll be keeping track of, which is the theodicy problem of mutations in various junk DNA components is the reason why it's doing something, because its functionality, that it's just itself doing the thing, plopping down and without any modification, and it's doing a bad thing. The fact that it's functional and the fact that it's doing something bad doesn't count very well for the designer, and therefore will pop on the theodicy issue. Already, the first couple papers that I looked into when I first set up the structure of it, because I bounced into a little bit, as I discussed in previous weeks, 2/3 of them are hitting the theodicy counter. It's only 3 sources, by the way, so it's 2 out of 3. Whether or not that value continues all the way down through the row, we'll find out. But boy, my understanding of ALUs are that most of the ones that actually have come to be seen to be functional are causing problems. And therefore, if they were designed to do that, then that's an issue which would need to be done up with. And I would think that Casey Luskin should be very, very reluctant to ever bring the subject up, but we'll find out on that. So anyway, that's going to be the big superstructure of the next weeks to come, which will be to bounce back and forth between a normal part 2 and the other thing as we continue to plow down through Sarfati and Tay source by source by source. Eventually, we'll have to figure out what kind of book I want to tackle after that. There's some interesting little sidebar possibilities in there that might be kind of intriguing to do. That one of which relates to more cultural issues, is not really about a creation science issue. And so I'm kind of reluctant to want to dive into that one, even though it's a fascinating historical example to see how an ideologue in another area is bumping into stuff. The other would be some of these little oddball books that I have popping around that um, dangle sources but don't have a proper coordination to it. So I'll if anybody has particular topics or particular books that come to mind, I'll have to check to see whether I have the book, for one thing. And I would be dealing with that. Some could be very, very old to find to put stuff together. I don't think there's a master bibliography in any of Michael Denton's books. You do get some in master bibliography in uh, the books by Steve Meyer. That could theoretically be done, even though he has a reference bibliography in it. Trying to figure out what sources are used for what claims would allow us to work out how much of it's being technically misrepresented and get a master total between the two books, because I'm unclear as to how much overlap there is. They seem to have about maybe 800-ish sources per book, but how much of that is fresh sources and how much of it's overlap, it's hard to tell. So that might be a set of topics to go into. And some of the really oldie but goodies like Dwayne Gish and others that may lack a proper grounding, although maybe less relevant in this time because print works are becoming less and less relevant in current anti-evolution apologetics, unless you happen to bump into somebody who's extremely old fart like me, that cut their eye teeth on that back in the day. So anyway, we're a little past a half hour on that. Our signal is holding up fairly well. Haven't seen any questions on the little sidebar on that. It's going to be an interesting little matter. The thing that's surprising me so far about Sarfati and Tay is that one, how much of their material, way over a quarter, is creationist sources. And the other is that their relatively limited citation of technical literature, they're misrepresenting way over half. So it's shooting off the scope as quite intense on that. And whether that holds out all the way out to the end of the book, we'll find out. There's so much left to do on the source material on that. But it's a different dynamic. There's virtually no authority quoting so far, which is also true of Nathaniel Jensen, who apparently is not prone to that. So that's a very different dynamic than, say, Rupin Sanford's books that are just an obsessive amount. And for that matter, stuff that you tend to get in Casey Luskin style apologetics is an awful lot of large quotation snippets to supposedly show their case. And that, of course, begs the question, is the whole content of the work coming up to that area? So anyway, we're a little past half hour. Let me put my little advert up for The Rocks Were There. Remember, links to all the books are always available, fiction and nonfiction, and also the Patreon account. If you can jump into that and go, hey, the old fart could use a few bucks a month from my end of it. Don't break your bank. Don't ever do that. And there have been some people that, their economic circumstances change and they've had to go into the legacy category on that. I well understand that. We live in perilous economic times at times. So anyway, let me cue up my Rocks Were There advert and let that run. And there we go. That's our little. Oh, I wish they were. I had a tentative but finally floundering attempt to do the first novel, reading them as an audiobook. And unfortunately, the person who helped to do it had to go off and do some other things, so it was never quite finished as a project. So alas and alack, at the moment, they are available only in print format and for Kindle ebook. That's where we're stuck on that at the moment. I'm quite happy with the Paralogue series. I'm about a quarter of the way through the third novel, which is Jewels to the Flame, which tidies up some of the loose ends that were dangling out in the first couple of novels. And we'll have some exciting adventures in that story, from escapades through the avenues of Paris during the 1878 World's Fair, to tracking down sinister Russian spies who are skulking all over the place, including chases on riverboats, and also the terrible dangers of people trying to do wading into pools that are used to store the nuclear waste from atomic reactors. This is not something you should do. But of course, what the hell would they know about the dangers of that in the 1870s? So there's an awful lot of stuff that's going on in that, with that, and masses of new characters, and as well as characters that are continuing in from the previous sagas, including Monsieur Dupin, who is a recurring character in the tale, and we get some little sidebars from our Rosalind Andrassy, who appeared in the second novel. And of course, our recurring wonderful characters, including some more material with Captain Nemo and his wonderful submarine Nautilus, that pops up as some sidebars in the tale. But there's an awful lot that's going on. And Auda, of course, is busy constructing her new little flyer to compete with Maker's Kestrel, and some new property that the Fogs have acquired out in Wales, where that's going to be figuring in novels, many, many, many novels for many, many years to come. I have the whole super cycle of the whole plot line worked out down to book 12. So it's a matter of then plugging together and cycling through to put my little bits and pieces and working out little sidebars on the things, so that when I come into working out each novel as they come, I got a pretty good structure of what's going on in the storyline, and often even down to what the chapter titles and things are called. Book 4 is already fairly well structured, and I'm continuing on through all the remainder ones. So with an epic scale that covers quite a few decades, it's really fun. And I love playing around with the history and the scientific development and the background culture. I was just looking up today about, are there any Cezanne paintings that someone could buy in the 1870s that are presently unknown and therefore are functionally a lost painting? That's the reason why it's lost, is because it's hanging on the walls of one of the Fogs houses. So we can look into all of that stuff. So anyway, everybody stay safe where you are. Hopefully your weather is not bad. Hopefully you're not having terrible things happening. Live to a ripe old age so you can finish them. I fully intend to live to a ripe old age. I have the advantage of being insufferable, and so I can often talk viruses and bacteria just to flee from my presence because they can't stand being around me. But I fully want to finish all of the Fog novels out. If we're running about 2 to 3 years per cycle, I may be pushing 100 by the time I finish the whole pile, but we'll see where we go on that. And then of course, there's also the science books it's one of the reasons why it slowed down the second Fog novel for me to get out, was because I was working on these books, and that ground me to a halt. Oh, good. It's a beautiful sunny autumn day there. So you are in the southern hemisphere. Haha, my deductions. Yes. I have to pay attention to that when I have characters that zip back and forth from one hemisphere to another, that they have to realize, well, if they're going to Africa, it's the opposite seasons in that particular spot and all that thing. That has to pop up. And if you have a craft that can fly at extreme speed, to go from winter in the northern hemisphere to the dead of summer in the southern hemisphere in the space of a few hours, pack carefully for your clothing. That's what will work out. So anyway, but I always love sticking in the interesting historical details, all the Paralogue's novels will be meticulously accurate for the context of the tale dropped down into the real world, even though there are fictional characters and fictional devices and all the rest. But the background of like what the railroad station was like and how much particular things cost and what the weather was like in particular times and all of that, I try to ground it in as much as possible to actual reality, like the super thick fogs that were in particular spots at particular times, or the excessive heat during the Centennial Exhibition in 1876 in Philadelphia. All of these little things are historically accurate for the time frame. And then I also try to get the science accurate apart from the things that are involving highly speculative things like time machines and alien visitors and all the rest. So it's an interesting little juggling match. And to merge that together with that world of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and the other science fiction tales that were knocking around during the time as well. It's not just them. And in that overly confident Victorian Edwardian world, where they couldn't really imagine how gunked up everything was going to get in the 20th century. Even though they could imagine dark sides. But H.G. Wells was in particular prone to thinking about potential downsides of invention and the future. But all of that's more in part. But anyway, I think you will enjoy the Fog novels, and I think you will enjoy the nonfiction work. And Jackson and I have several books in the line, in addition to Rocks Volume 2, which with a little bit of luck, we should have out in 2025. I think that's a pretty good thing because there's an awful lot of material. As we did with the first volume, we were plugging new information that was coming on stream right up to like the days before we actually finalized it as a manuscript. So we try to keep it as up to date as possible. Anyway, everybody stay safe. Keep away from wooden penguins. You know they're out to get you. And if you're in the place where you can still vote, make sure you are registered to vote and you're voting for people who are not idiots and that can further the civilization of humanity and not the debasement of it. I can certainly see examples of that in the United States that I have to watch out for. And everything is going to be very exciting over the next 6 months to find out whether we get to keep our democracy long term. So anyway, okay, so we've got our commercial in, and everybody's going well, and we will conclude this stream, and we will see you next week with some more Casey Luskin crap. Okie dokie. Ending stream.